So on behalf of all of us, welcome to Beth Messiah Congregation. Come and share with us today. And I have a little clicker here I'll give you. And here you can just speak from there and then... And we'll,
the first picture up and then
okay. There you go. And then just after that, you're ready to go.
there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. When I was growing up in Boston, we were members of an Orthodox congregation where we sat up on top and the men and women never sat together, and I was told if I was up on the bema, I'd get struck down, so this is lovely. I'm second generation. My father, Morris Dash, was a Holocaust survivor. My father was from Plońsk, Poland, which was right outside of Warsaw, about 45 minutes, and he was the youngest of 4 children. I had grandparents, Lazar and Devorah, and I had 3 uncles that were considerably older than my father. A photographer went through Plońsk, and my grandfather and my oldest uncle were not in Plońsk to have their picture taken. There were no cameras then. So that's my uncle Shapsa. My father's in the middle, Toibia, my grandmother Devorah, and I have no idea what my grandfather Lazar and my uncle Simcha looked like. If I saw a picture of them, I wouldn't even know it was them. And it was daunting growing up not to know who I really looked like. My father went to religious school, all through school. Every day they'd walk to the 2 Orthodox synagogues that were in Plońsk. Plońsk had Jews. I found them back in the 1600s. Depending on what you read, there were 8,000 to 12,000 Jews in Plońsk. And every day when he walked to school, the Polish kids, anti-Semitism, he was born in 23, was coming up in the 20s already. And they'd throw rocks at the kids and they'd hit them with sticks. And, you know, it was a battle every day just to go to school. So one day he went home crying, and my grandfather said, listen, you have to defend yourself. You come home crying, I'm going to give you something to cry about. My father used that on my brother and I too. So he had to stand up, he had to be strong, and I think that really helped him get through the war. You know, there were over 6 million Jews that were killed in the camps. My dad was in Auschwitz and Birkenau, and they were responsible for over 1 million. There were 1.5 million children, innocent children, babies that were murdered. It's hard to fathom. So my dad, you know, he kept going to school, and anti-Semitism was rising, and then the Germans came in and they took Poland in a week because the Poles, people say, why didn't the Jews fight? Why didn't the Poles fight? Well, sticks and stones versus tanks and ammunition and planes, what are you going to fight with? So Poland fell quickly, and anti-Semitism, of course, became more prevalent. So before they put people in ghettos, they started to take away businesses from the Jews. My great-uncle Avrum was a tailor. They took away his business. They were stripping them of everything to make a living and, you know, to care for their families. In Plońsk, they put a yellow star on the Jews on the front and back. They wanted to see you coming and going. The Germans and the Poles would do everything to humiliate you. One day, my grandparents were Orthodox. Everybody was Orthodox back then. The rabbi from one of the shuls, he was walking in Plońsk Square. They knocked him down on the ground. They took a knife and they took his beard off to where my dad said he was bleeding. And, just any type of humiliation. So things were obviously not going in a good direction, and eventually they were taken to the ghetto. So they took the people out of the, lower end of town, put them in the Jews' homes in the better end of town, which wasn't so nice anyways. But, and everybody was allowed to take one suitcase, and they were marched into a ghetto. So now you have 8,000 to 12,000 people, and they were sitting there in a very constricted area, fenced off with barbed wire, and you'd have 8 to 10 people in one room. They didn't have running water. They didn't have electricity. There was very little coal. There was very little wood. And there were lice, and lice brought typhus, and people got tuberculosis, and this was the beginning of the final solution, because people started dying. Every day they took people out, they put them on carts. The carts would take them to a field where holes were dug, and they'd burn the people. So this went on. My father was a rebel. If you told him to go left, he'd go right. I'm very much my father's child, as Gus would know. And, he would take the star off. If you were caught and they found out you were Jewish without your star, you'd be killed. He'd take his star off. He'd walk out. He would try to barter. He would try to get some coal. He'd try to get some food. My grandparents were strictly Orthodox. They wouldn't eat anything he brought in. They didn't know if it was kosher or not. They wouldn't take it. They were going to die because they were Jews, and this was the way it was going to be. So, this is how they lived, and they managed, to survive the time in the ghetto. So many didn't. Some of my dad's relatives didn't. And eventually, they started the deportations to the camps. Everybody in Ployns went to Birkenau. And each transport had 2,000 people on it. The first transport that went out were the elderly and the disabled. So my grandparents were on the first transport. They were younger than I am. And my dad and his 3 brothers walked them to the train, which was a cattle car with no seats. The train had 2 buckets in it. One bucket was for human waste, one bucket was water. And they had their one suitcase. They were packed in like sardines. You couldn't even move. My dad handed my grandmother a blanket, and she handed it back to him. She goes, "You take this, you need this, you're going to be the only one that survives." As he was not a tall guy, but he was a tough guy. So they were taken to Birkenau, and they were killed once they arrived. Every 2 weeks, 2,000 left. If you had railroad tracks in your city, then you got a one-way trip to a work camp, a concentration camp, a death camp, but they were all death. That's what it all meant in the end. If you lived, like my best friend Sandy, her family lived in Trochenbrod. They didn't have a train station, so there were killing fields. There were gas vans where they drove people around, and the carbon monoxide gassed them, and then they were put into pits and burned. But there was a train station in Ployns, so everybody got a one-way ticket. When they arrived in Ployns, my dad was on the 3rd transport with his brother Shop, so they were the 2 youngest. And 500 people went to work, and 1,500 went to the gas chambers. So when they got off the train, the Dobermans, the German Shepherds, they were barking, "Raus," and the German soldiers were screaming, "Raus, raus, hurry, hurry, get off the train." You had to unload the dead bodies. It was a 3-day trip. Some people did not survive that, and stack them up. And then everybody was told to take all of their clothes off and put their clothes on top of their suitcases. If they had shoelaces, tie the shoes together so that they weren't, you'd have them when you came out. Put your glasses in a pile. Everything was piled up nicely. And they were given a bar of soap, and they went into the gas chambers, and instead of taking a shower after a 3-day trip, they were all gassed. My dad, he was taken into the line to go to work. He was shaved from head to toe, because if lice came in, it would wipe out the population that was working, because they'd get typhoid. And that killed everybody quickly. So they were shaved from head to toe. They were given a uniform, striped pajamas, a beanie hat, wooden shoes. They were given the tattoo. My dad's number was 83988. He was the 83,988th person to walk in to Auschwitz, to Birkenau. He was taken immediately to the barracks. He was standing outside with some people he didn't know to go into the barracks to sleep. And they counted you in at night, and the same amount, dead or alive, had to come out in the morning. And he quickly learned you never took the bottom bunk, because people would get physically ill. They'd vomit, they'd get diarrhea, they'd urinate, and if you were in the bottom, you were covered, and there was no place to shower or clean up. There were holes in cement, and that was the bathroom facility. So he asked the guy standing next to him, where did all the families go? And the fellow pointed to the crematoriums, which belched 24 hours a day, smoke. He said, they're all there. They're going up in smoke. They're burning them. So my dad really didn't want to live at that point. He had seen enough. But they weren't going to kill him. They weren't going to waste a bullet on him. So he went in. The next morning, they took him out to work. And the first thing he had to do was work on the bodies, pulling them out of the gas chambers. When you had to pull the people apart, they were all holding on to each other. And when you pulled them out, you had to shave their hair. Their hair was used to stuff comforters and pillows, and everything was sent back to Germany because we want the Nazis to be very comfortable. So that's what they used all the hair for. Then the fillings in your teeth back then were solid gold. So they had to take pliers and pull the gold out of people's mouths so it could be melted down, and that's what funded the war machine. And then they had to go through all the clothing, because women were pretty smart. They made false hems, they made false pockets, and they brought coins and their wedding rings and anything they thought they could barter to make things a little bit easier. So they had to go through all the clothing and pull everything out of there. And then they were sent to the crematoriums. They were put on carts and taken away. So my dad did that for a while. Then he was sent to bricklaying school, and he learned to build the crematoriums he built the barracks in Birkenau and Auschwitz. Auschwitz had 3 main camps and thousands of sub-camps. Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, which was Birkenau, which was the main death camp, and Auschwitz III, which was Buna or Monowitz, which were factories. So my dad was sent over with his brother to Auschwitz III, and he was going to work in the Farben factory. And my other 2 uncles were there. It took 3 days, and my dad finally saw his brothers for the last time. Typhus broke out. My dad and Shopsa were sent back to Birkenau, and my 2 uncles were murdered at Buna. So he went back, and then he was sent to Yanyina, which was a sub-camp, which was a coal mine, where he got black lung disease because they didn't give you any kind of respirators. They just sent you underground to mine the coal, and he was there for, he thinks, 4 to 6 months. So, and then he was sent back again to Auschwitz I. In the meantime, when he was at the coal mines, Shopsa did not survive either. So when he got back, his last remaining relative that he knew of was gone. So the Russians were coming up. It's over 2 years now that he's in there. And the Russians were approaching Auschwitz. And Hitler said, the world is never going to know what went on here. The world knew. The planes were flying over every day. My father said you could see the American flag on the planes, the British flag, the French flag. I mean, they didn't drop a bomb. If they had dropped a bomb, how wonderful. They would have killed some people, but if you blew out those train tracks, as I said, that was the only way to get the people in there. So they decided they were going to blow up all the crematoriums and blow up Auschwitz, and they started to try to do this, and the Russians were too close. So they took over 30,000 people out on a death march in January through the forests in Poland. Poland's cold. People had wooden shoes. They didn't have coats. They didn't have food. The snow was what they were eating. The remaining people that the Russians liberated were just too sick to make the death march. So they're marching in the snow, in the cold, and they're going to take them 30, 40 miles to the trains, put them on a train to Germany to another death camp. The bodies were littering the forest because people were not surviving. And even the Germans were dying. I mean, they didn't have anything with them. And even though they had coats and guns, they had nothing with them. So my dad, after the third day, said, well, I'm going to die anyways, so I'm going to run. He didn't tell anybody. He ran into the forest. They shot at him a couple times. 2 guys followed him that he didn't know. And then they were the wandering Jews. They didn't know where they were. And they're roaming, and they're sleeping in the forest, and they're sleeping in barns, and they broke into a house, and they were in a Polish farmer's house, and he came back, and he let them stay for a bit. But then he said, the Germans are coming, and I'm not going to die for you. So they were sent out again. And then the Russians came upon them on tanks and said, you're liberated. You're free. And here's guns. Go shoot the Germans. And my father never owned a gun till the day he died. I mean, the last thing he wanted to do was go kill anybody, German or otherwise. That was just not his personality. And he had no idea where he was in Poland, had no idea how to get back to Ploinsk. He was 99.9% sure that his family was all gone. But the Russians helped him, and it took like 3 weeks, and they got him back to Ploinsk. And 50 people came back. So he couldn't get into his home. People were living there and were not relinquishing anything that belonged to the Jews that were run out of town. He managed to get into his uncle's home, and 6 of them, his friends, they were there, and now what are they supposed to do? I mean, they really didn't have a formal education, and where are they supposed to go? Everybody's dead. Everything was taken away from them. They don't have any families, just each other. And they had no idea what to do. And, so they were trying to make a living. And my father said after like 4 months, there was a knock on the door. It was the Polish army. You're drafted. So he said, no, not doing that, not fighting for you. So he went to Germany, and he went to a DP camp, a displaced persons camp. My grandmother had a brother and a sister that left in the early 20s, and they went to Boston, and their name was Shyman. So my father wanted to go to Palestine to fight. He didn't care if he got killed. He didn't have anything, and that's what he wanted to do. And the American soldier said, well, do you have family anywhere? And he goes, yes, I have an uncle and an aunt in Boston. Well, you're not going to Palestine. So it took a couple years to find my great uncle and my great aunt, because they changed their name to Simon. And there were no computers then, no internet. So they found them, and Mo got on the boat, and he said it was the most horrendous trip you could ever imagine. He would never get on a boat again in his life. And he went to New York. His uncle had become very wealthy in real estate and politics in Boston, had 2 daughters, did not come to New York to pick him up. So he lands in New York Harbor, and it's St. Patrick's Day, and nobody knew what St. Patrick's Day was in Poland. And my father thought the world had lost their minds because everybody was drunk. Green beer, green donuts, green bagels. He was told America was paved in gold. Yeah. So, and then they put him on a train, and they sent him to Boston. And his 2 cousins were there, and they recognized him from that picture, because that's the picture that was sent to their father. And they could speak Yiddish to each other, because my dad spoke not a word of English. And he was taken to their home in Brookline, and they had this huge home. I had been in it many times. And my uncle's wife didn't really want him. She brought her whole family from Poland, but the only remaining family from, his sister was not welcome. She put a mattress in a closet for my father, and I'm telling you, they had a big house. But he was more than happy to be in the closet on a mattress from where he had come from and in the United States. So my great aunt said, well, he's got no education, no skills. I'm going to send him to work in a deli. And he worked in a deli by downtown Boston all night, every night. And he was sweeping floors, and he learned how to make the corned beef and the potato salad. And he, eventually became a deli man. And my great uncle was going to look at a piece of property by Springfield, Mass. And he took this young man with him that he knew was really getting into real estate and home improvements and all, and was telling this fellow about the nephew. So my father meets Herb, and they become best friends. And Herb picks my dad up every morning at the deli, and he drives around with him. And my dad sleeps. My dad's learning English. He's waving his flag. He was proud to be an American, and he was learning to study for naturalization. And after about 8 months, Herb takes my father home on Shabbos for dinner, and in walks Herb's sister. And this was in November, and in February they were married. So my father was a huge risk taker, and obviously, and so was my mother. And so they ended up opening a restaurant in Natick, Massachusetts, and my dad asked his uncle for $3,500 to start his business so he could buy equipment and all, and the aunt said no. So he went to a banker and told the banker his story, and the banker lent him the money, and thank God. And my father opened his restaurant with no help from anybody in his family. They were horrible. And, they considered him damaged goods. Well, he was, but nobody had a better attitude than my father. And my father loved everybody. And so he opened his restaurant, he bought a house, and I was born 2 weeks later, and my brother Larry 2 years after me. So when I speak to kids in schools, I said, don't tell me you can't do something. Don't even think that, because my father came with no formal education, couldn't speak a word of English, and he had a wife, 2 kids, a house, a business, and was a successful, man for the times. So there was a girl down the street, and her father had a number 2. So, I said, what do you think those numbers are? I was like 7. And she said, it's our phone number. So I, being little Mo, go down, look at the number. I'm like, right back up the street, not your phone number. So at 7 years old, I went to the library and read my first book, Treblinka, which was not appropriate. But, I figured out why there was no family. So I kept reading and reading, which I still do today. And finally, my mother finds all these books under my bed and calls her mother to come out because she couldn't deal with me. And so my grandmother started telling me age appropriate, which wasn't, because I had already read everything that was there to read, which wasn't a lot. But she gave me some information, and eventually when I was like 11, my father started talking to me because he knew. And so that's how this came to be, because he went all over the state and he spoke. And when he passed away, it'll be 20 years next month, the teachers started calling and they said, well, you do it. So here I am going all over the state speaking. So I really needed to, my mom was first generation American, her family was from Ukraine, and I just needed to go to Poland and feel Poland and see where my ancestors were. So in 1984, it was still communist, and my father, my brother, my cousin Mark from New York, my best friend Paul Abramowitz from LA, we took off and we went to Poland. So this is the Warsaw Ghetto Monument. We landed in Warsaw. That was all that was left, was just a monument. But everywhere we went, we said Kaddish, including there. Then we went to the shul that was rebuilt by the Americans. The Germans had taken it and made it into a barn for horses. The Americans came in and they rebuilt it. It was a yurt site for my friend Paul's father. And my father went over and spoke to the caretaker of the shul. And he said, we need 10 men. There were 4 of them and me, but I didn't count. And he said, no, nobody will come out. We're afraid. So my dad slipped him $20, was like $1 million back then. And we were able to say Kaddish for Irving. And then this was all of us. I had a very bad permanent, but that's my father, myself, that's my brother, my cousin, and my friend Paul. And we're standing out in front of the cemetery in Warsaw, which was not taken care of, as you can see. All the stones and everything were knocked over, and the most magnificent stones you've ever seen. I mean, it just told a story. And 10 years ago, my youngest son was on March of the Living, where they spent Yom HaShoah in Poland, and then Yom HaTzmaut and Yom HaZikaron in Israel. So he was going into the cemetery with a group of kids from Bexley and the group he was with from Cleveland. And he was with an Israeli soldier and a Polish soldier. And there was a woman standing outside, and she started screaming in Polish, and Aaron said, what's she saying? Jews, we thought we killed you all. Why do you keep coming back here? We don't want you. So my son called me, obviously hysterical. That was his first anti-Semitic attack. But the Americans came and they rebuilt the cemetery and righted the stones. So in Ploinsk, this is where my dad went, and this is where he went every day to get water from that pump. And he always talked about it my whole life. That's what was left of the cemetery that my ancestors were buried in. It was desecrated, and so there's just a monument there. And by the way, David Ben-Gurion was my dad's neighbor. He's a Ploinsker. That's what the houses looked like that my dad grew up in. And some of the people came and said, "Whoa, you're alive." They recognized him. It was amazing. This was a picture I took of a picture that a woman showed me in her home. And Ploinsk was bustling before the war. That was the square where my dad was standing. And this woman had all of these items from my dad's best friend, Irving Wasserman's house. I didn't speak Polish, but when she said Wassersuk, that was his Polish name. And, you know, I tried to get a teacup, anything to take back to him, and she wouldn't give me anything. Nothing. That was one of the two shuls. They were very grand. They're both gone. They were burned. That is the railroad car. That's what my dad and my family rode in. Paul and I were at Treblinka. Now Treblinka, I've been back. It's got monuments there, but then it was just the fields that were mass graves. I was at Majdanek, and the barracks, one barracks was all hats up and down, both sides. One was all shoes, one was all children's shoes. By the time Paul and I walked out the other end with the children's shoes, we were laying on the ground outside hysterical. It was, those were all people. And they had cans of Zyklon. This was my dad's barracks at Birkenau. And this is leading up to the barracks. Now it's all cleaned up. They've made it into a real tourist place. They make a lot of money on Auschwitz. Now you can see the tracks. If you look at the current pictures, it doesn't look like that. Those are the bombed out crematoriums at Birkenau. That's the table that they did medical experiments on. People threw themselves up against this fence, the barbed wire fences, because they were electrified and they didn't want to live anymore. And Polish soldiers that were on a tour that my dad started leading because he said we knew the story and he could speak to them in Polish and really tell them what went on and not, yeah. And those are the tracks that lead to Birkenau where selection, that's where all the selections were made. And that's Dad and Larry and I in front of the ruins of the crematorium. And it's just one mass cemetery. It's everywhere you walked. My father's number, 83988. The bunks, 4 to 6 people in each one of those little areas. That was the latrine. They had a place to put wood to make things a little warmer in the winter, but they never burned anything in there. And that's what they took the bodies with every day. And that's the gas chamber, crematorium. And I walked my father stupidly through those gates without thinking about it until I was standing there that he walked through. Arbeit macht frei, work makes freedom. That had to be horrible. That was one of the blocks he stayed in. And that was the shooting range. They put people up there and shoot them. And that was in Jena, where he worked in the coal mine. And Hitler didn't win. That's my niece Nicole, my nephew Jacob, my son Scott, my niece Emily, and my son Aaron. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. And it's certainly, very poignant. And you're right, at the end of the day, we're still here.
We're still here. And we have, anti-Semitism is rampant. And, I work with the FBI, former FBI agent who security for Jewish Columbus and all the shoals and the dark underground. And we had Wiesenthal Center here before the pandemic, and they spoke about the dark web. And I think I'm relatively educated. I was blown away. Columbus is number 2 in the country.
Yeah. I'm going to just get the microphone here, and I'm going to ask you about what you're doing currently. I know that you work with the Anti-Defamation League, and just tell us a little bit about what you're doing. Here you go. There you go.
We are doing a program.
Yeah, I think it's on. Yeah.
We're doing a program at Congregation Beth Tikva, Echoes and Reflections. It's a program for teachers. It's going to be held the 6th and 7th of June. Optional day trip on the 8th to Cincinnati to the Holocaust Museum. Oh, there it is.
There it is. Okay.
I have a big voice anyways. And if anybody's interested, let me know. We closed registration, but I'm doing this with Rabbi Rick Kellner, and I can get you in with no problem. And we have like close to 60 enrolled. We're also doing a program, No Place for Hate, with the ADL. They go into schools from K through 12 and to businesses to teach that people shouldn't hate. And so I have 3 schools already, Rick and I set up to do this. Hilliard, Worthington, and Dublin.
That's great.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And how have you been received in your travels? How are you received?
Well, sometimes not so good. Sometimes I've had people, I like to tell people that Israel needs to survive because we didn't have a place to go. And we have to have a country. We have to have a place to go. Keep your passports current. And I've had Palestinian and Muslim children come up and say, they're murderers. In my face. I spoke at the Newark Public Library to an adult group, and after talking about the Holocaust, I had a woman tell me I'm not talking about the right thing. I should be talking about aborted fetuses. I never know what I'm going to get. I had a student stand up in South Charleston, Ohio. It's so small, the middle school and the high school are together. The 8th grader, it was the day before Trump was elected. He stood up when I was done talking about rounding up the Jews and said, tomorrow, Donald Trump is going to round up all the Muslims when he's elected and kill everybody. And I'm like, oy vey. I'm like, Muslims are not bad people. And you just have to be ready for everything.
So what would you say, to all of us? How can we all make a positive difference in all of this?
Well, first of all, we have to be vigilant about what's around us. We have to speak up. We need to speak up. We cannot be silent. My girlfriend Sandy, she wears her Mug and David inside, And my son Aaron wears it right outside. And Sandy, who's second generation like me, she said to Aaron, "I'm afraid." I said, "What are you afraid of all things? What are you afraid of?" But I've worn mine at work, and I've gotten some, some of the customers, yeah. And, you know, even when I was a nurse at Children's Hospital, I had people make comments about my Star of David. And that was years ago, before I went into my father's business. So,
Right.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Following,
Keep doing what you're doing.
that's it. And following our service, we have an Oneg luncheon. You're welcome to stay, answer some questions, meet some of our folks. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us.
Thank you.
God bless you. Thank you.